So I've got now a blank file which contains or is going to contain the code for UserDao. So if you recall, the way we used UserDao in the login route for the Flask program that we're writing is we said DAO equals UserDao, and then we said user equals DAO dot select by user ID. And the user ID that's right here that was passed in was the user ID that came in from the form submit on the login page. So now what I want to do is I want to write the code that makes UserDao work. All right. So how are we going to get that to work? Well, if you recall in our homegrown web framework, what the UserDao basically did was it interacted with a file. That was our data store. So we wrote users into the data store and we read users out of the data store. And then we provided through the UserDao a whole bunch of really useful methods to select, insert, update, and delete users from the UserDao. And then we did the same thing with books. So for the email program that you've been writing, you want to do the same thing for users and for emails. All right, but this UserDao is going to be a little bit different. We're going to use another framework. We're actually going to use a very simple SQL database to read and write users. All right, so to get this started, we're going to import dataset. So the dataset is a special framework that allows us to manipulate users through a very simple relational database called SQLite. And then we're going to say from user, import user. So we can take a look at the code for that. Let's see. So book footer, Flask, user.py. So that's our user. It's exactly the same as the user was for our homegrown framework. Let me zoom in a little bit here so you can see a little better. It's exactly the same as the user from our homegrown framework. It's just a constructor which passes in a user ID and password and sets an internal member user ID and password to those values, and a toString method that lets us dump out the user ID and password. Okay. So let's go back to our UserDao, the one that we're writing here. There we go. Okay. All right, so let's write a class, UserDao, so we can create instances of this class. And we're going to create a constructor. Remember, there's 2 underscores when you create that constructor, and it takes self as an argument. And we're going to do a couple things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a connect string. So the connect string is the thing that identifies the location of the data store that we want to manipulate. So the connect string is going to be SQL lite colon 123 users.db. So this weird looking, oops, I didn't quite spell that correctly. I needed E there. This weird looking string is how we connect to the simple relational database that's supported by this data set framework that we're going to use as our data store. Then we're going to connect to the database. Self.db equals connect dataset.connect. And we're going to say self.connectString. Okay. And then self.table equals self.db users. Okay, so what just happened here? Well, what I did was I created an abstraction of a data store that represents a table, like kind of like a spreadsheet. Um, and the table is called users.db. And what I said is I want to connect to that table users.db. Well, I want to connect to the data store users.db that's going to hold the table. And then I want to find the table that's called users in users.db. Users.db actually on the operating system is a file, but it's not a file that you could go in and edit. It contains all kinds of weird bytes and weird characters and stuff like that that you wouldn't want to mess around with. But what it does is it allows us to work with data in a tabular form and write some really interesting queries against the data that we wouldn't be able to do if it was a flat file. And you're going to see those queries in a moment. So I think right now, if you're thinking like, well, how is this different from a regular flat file? It's different from a regular flat file because the framework lets us view the data as basically a table that we can manipulate. So you can imagine a spreadsheet with one row, one column that is the user's column, user ID column, another column that's the password column, and then every user is a row in that table. So there's Bob with CSRox55, and Shai with CSRox55, and Ralph with CSRox55, and Tim with CSRox55. So those are each rows in this spreadsheet or table that's called users. Okay, so let's try to write some code that would allow us to get all of the data, all of the users out of the database. All right, that's an easy one to start out with. So def select all self dot, let's see, table. Okay, we already have that. So self dot table. Oh, I see. Okay. Whoops, sorry. Rows equals self dot table. Dot all. Okay, so the framework provides this really awesome method called all. So if you say all on a table, all the rows for that table are going to be returned. Now, in our data store, the users.db data store, we only have one table called users. So if we say self.table.all, we're going to get all of the users that are in the table. This is fantastic. And we're going to store those in rows. Now, the problem with this approach is that we need to convert all of the rows into user objects. So right now, they're not user objects, they're rows from the table. So we need to go through a conversion operation. And so I'm going to say result equals an empty list. And then I'm going to say for row in rows, result dot append self dot row to user. And we're going to pass in row. So we're going to have a method called row to user, just like we did with our homegrown framework, that takes in a row, this time from our framework table for users. So it takes in a row. So the row would be a user ID and a password, and converts it into a user object that contains a user ID and password. And then we're going to return result. All right, now I haven't written the code for row to user, but we're about to do that in just a second. But I just want to make sure you understand the big picture here. So instead of doing like file IO operations, opening a file and reading stuff from a file and doing string conversions and all that junk, we just have to write one line of code, self.table.all, that returns all the rows in the users table in our data store. That's amazing, right? All that work's done for free for us for just using the framework. Then we have to go through the process of conversion to convert the users from the row format of user ID and password into a user object format. And then we return all the users that we've converted in result. Okay, so we do have to write a little bit of code just above here, and that code is the code for row to user. All right, so row to user. Now what that's going to do is it's going to take a row and convert it into a user. So, whoops, I need row as an argument as well. All right, so we're going to say user is equal to user, and the row is basically a dictionary object. That's what every row from the table users looks like when we return a row. It's a dictionary object that is indexable by a key, which is the name of the column. So in this table that we've created, this users table, we have a user ID column and a password column. So if I say row sub user ID, I'll get the user ID column for this particular row that I've returned. If I say row sub password, I'll get the data that's in the password part of the row. So that's really cool. All right, so then I'm going to return row. Now we also have an opposite, a twin to that, which is user to row. So I might as well write that now just to be consistent. User to row, self user takes in a user, and it's responsible for creating a row. So row is equal to, and this is a dictionary object, which consists of the dictionary, which consists of a user ID. That's the key for the dictionary object for one of the attributes in the dictionary object. The user ID is equal to user.userid, and the password is equal to user.password. And then we're going to return row. And oh, I made a mistake here. We're going to return user here. All right, so this takes a data set. I'll put a comment here. This takes a data set and converts it into a user object. And this takes a user object and converts it into a data set row. All right, so that's select all. Now we did have, we weren't actually using select all when we wrote the code in the login route. We actually had a different select. So the next thing we need to do once we've done the select all is to write the code to select a single user ID. So the way we're going to do that is create a def select by user ID. Passing in self and passing in the user ID. All right, now we're going to use another super awesome method from the dataset framework. So we're going to say row is equal to self.table.select, or sorry, find one. So if we do find one, then we pass in user ID. Actually, we identify user ID. That is the name of the column in the users table that we want to search. That's the name of the column. And then we're going to set that equal to the user ID that was passed in to the method select by user ID. So this first user ID right here, that's the column. So we're going to search the user ID column in the user table. And then the second user ID here, that is the user ID that was passed in to the method. Okay, so we're going to do that. And then we're going to set result equals to none. So we're going to either return a user object or we're going to return none if we didn't find the user we were looking for. All right, so I'm going to check now to see if row is equal to none. Row is none. If the row is none, we have an error because that meant that we went to search for this user and we didn't find it. Okay, so logger.error failed to find user with. Yeah, now I'm thinking about that. That's not really an error, right? If the user mistypes their user ID, it's not really a programming error, so maybe we'll say warning, logger.warning, failed to find user with plus user ID. Okay, and then that's it. And then we're going to do an else. So the else is result is equal to self.row to user, and then we're going to pass the row in that we got back from the call to table.find1. So if the row is none, it means we didn't find the user, we're going to log a warning, and we're going to return none as a result. If the row is not none, it means we did get a user, and so we're going to call self.row to user to convert the row into a user object, and we're going to return that result. So I'm going to say return result here. So the result will either be null or it won't. Cool. All right, so if you remember, when we have a data access object, the goal of the data access object is to give us a CRUD mechanism, a CRUD interface that allows the controllers in the system to create, read, update, and delete. So the reading we've taken care of with select all and select by user ID. So we've got the reading of users from the data store taken care of, but we also need to insert, update, and delete users. And we also need to write a populate method. All right, so how do we insert? Well, if I say def insert self user self.table.insert. Now this is incredible. Okay, so it turns out that the table has an insert method. Again, so we don't have to do any filing. We just use this insert method. So the dataset framework has this insert method. And if we do it correctly, we'll just be able to insert another user into this table. So we need to insert a row. And I said earlier that rows are basically dictionaries that have a key of user ID with a user ID value and another key of password with a password value. So all we have to do is insert a dictionary object that has a correctly set user ID value and a correctly set password value. And we wrote a method called user to row right up here that does that for us. So we give this method a user, and we get output a dictionary, and then we can insert that dictionary right into the table. So table insert self dot user to row user. That's it. Oh, one other thing. Self.db.commit. This just says do the insert and then make sure it gets saved to the table. That's what that db.commit does. It's very common in databases to do that. If you make a change to the database, you want to turn around and say, okay, I want to commit that change. All right. Well, that takes care of insert. So now we've got the create part taken care of CRUD, the read part taken care of CRUD. Now we have to do the update and delete. And as it turns out, those are really, really easy when we use this dataset framework. We just say def insert, def update self user, and then self dot table dot, you guessed it, update. And we're going to say that we want to update a particular user. And so there's an interesting way that you specify this. So first of all, we're going to pass the user in. Now the user right now is a user object, so we're going to pass in a user row by saying self.user to row of user. And then we're going to say the dictionary object that we're passing in contains this row, and the row has a set of columns associated with it, okay? And in our case, the columns are the user ID column, the password column, all right? The question is, when we do the update, how does it know what row is supposed to update, right? How does it know? Well, the answer is we specify in this list that follows the row that we're passing in that, that we're interested in updating the user that has the user ID specified in this user, in this dictionary that we're passing in. So remember, the dictionary is going to contain a user ID, let's say Bob, and it's going to contain a password, CSRock55. Now let's say Bob wanted to change their password to CSRock66. Well, we would call update with a user that contains Bob and the password CSRock66. We're going to call the self.table.update method. It's going to pass in a row, a user that's converted into a row, which is a dictionary object. That dictionary object is going to contain the user ID of Bob and the password of CSRock66. And then we're giving the dataset update framework a hint. Go into the table, look in the user ID column, and find the user ID that matches this row that we passed in. So that'll find the user ID Bob. In the table, the user ID will have a password of CSRock55. But this instruction says, go update that row where Bob is and change the password to CSRock66. So that's how that update's going to work. Now we're going to go self.db.commit. All right. Now, the next thing we have to do is a delete. Def delete self user. All right, so self.table.delete. And here what we're going to do is we're going to specify an argument. We're going to say the user ID, that's the column that we want you to look in for choosing which row to delete. And the user ID value from, I gotta change that. Change this here. User ID. Okay. All right, so what this says is go into the user table, look at the user ID column, and find the user that has the user ID that's the same as this user object user ID that's being passed in. So for example, if we wanted to delete Bob from the table, the user ID and password, the user ID Bob and now the password CSRock66, since we just changed things in the table, we'd pass in the user Bob, and that would have the password of CSRock66. We'd invoke this self.table.delete method and would say, search all of the users in the user table, look at their user IDs, and find the users that match the user ID that's the same as the object user.userid. So if we passed in Bob CSRock66, it's going to say, all right, delete all the users with the user ID Bob. So every row in the users table that had the user ID Bob would get deleted. And then we'll say self.db.commit. All right, def populate. So the last thing we have to do is we have to be able to build up a database. Now, what you've been able to do so far with the homegrown framework, if you wanted to build up the database, you just go in and edit a text file and just put in user IDs and passwords. You can't do that if you use the dataset framework with the DAO that we've just created. And the reason why is there's all kinds of crazy formatting and stuff that we don't really control, we can't control. But in exchange for that weird formatting of that users.db data store, that file that's on in the same directory as all this Python code, is that we have these really sweet methods that we don't have to write a lot of code for to manipulate, to delete, to update, to insert, to find, to select all. It's like, it's really, really nice. We don't have to write a lot of code, and that is awesome. All right, so, but that means we can't edit the users.db table directly. So how do we populate the table? Well, you do this. You say self.table.insert, self.user to row, and then we're just going to pass in a bunch of users. So here's Bob with the password CSRox55. We'll just create a bunch of these. Like Ralph and Shy and Tim. All right, I'll just get the formatting correct here. And I just need to change these users. This is Ralph. This is Shy. And this is Tim. So self.db.commit. So this is an example of eating your own dog food, right? If I want to create a database from scratch, kind of a starter database, I just have to run this populate method, and I can create it from scratch. And I can run that populate method anywhere. So for example, I could run this populate method right from the command line. In fact, maybe we'll do that in just a second. All right, so let's save this. And save this, and we'll run the populate method. So all right, so I'm going to say Python 3 and oh no, you know how I'm going to do this? I got a really easy way of doing this. That's really simple. All right, let's forget this. Control D, get out of that. Okay. Emacs UserDao.py. Okay. So let's go down here, and there's the populate method. And right here, we'll say DB, DAO equals user DAO, and then DAO dot populate. Populate. Okay. So if you run the user DAO directly, you'll run the populate method. And so if we look here, there is a users.db method or users.db data store already. I'm going to remove that users.db so we can start from scratch. I misspelled that, users.db. Okay. And then I'm going to say Python 3 UserDao.py. Okay, so I just ran it. And now if I do an ls star.db, you'll see that there's a users.db. Now, if I Emacs users.db, you'll see, like, you see how there's all this weird stuff in there? And if you look down towards the bottom, you can see that Bob's CSRox55, Ralph CSRox55, and Shy CSRox55, they're in there somewhere, but this is not a table that you would edit. Okay, so that takes care of our discussion of the user DAO and the dataset framework that we can use with the user DAO to greatly simplify the work that we have to do to make user DAOs operate.